Welcome to the Asia Political Review, my new podcast, and I thank you for joining me. The subject today is U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and his recent speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. Well, he went there to project American resolve, but I don't think he quite managed it. I think his speech had all the familiar notes, like China is the central challenge, that allies need to do more, and that burden sharing is a test of your seriousness. But none of that matters because everybody knows the challenge. Asia knows that China's more assertive, more capable, and more willing to apply pressure than it was a decade ago. And you just ask the Philippines about that. But Hegseth, I think, is just too tone deaf or simply too incompetent to understand those regional dynamics. And that's where his speech falls apart. He doesn't understand that security in Asia doesn't rest on military power alone. It rests on trust, on continuity. It rests on the sense that American commitments will hold even when the political mood in Washington shifts. So his remarks did nothing to reinforce any kind of confidence. What it did was signal that the United States wants the status and the prestige of leadership, while being impatient with what leadership requires. In fact, he treats cooperation like an HR performance review. Spend more, show clearer alignment, more loyalty, or run the risk of not being seen as serious. Now, that might work for domestic conservative audiences, and it lands well there. But in the rest of the world, I think it lands flat. It makes partnership feel conditional and dependent upon loyalty to Donald Trump. So it's not only that Hegseth and Washington are asking way too much, but it's asking the wrong way. This assertive kind of public diplomacy is simply a poor substitute for credibility. If anything, it undermines whatever Washington is trying to strengthen here. Governments in Asia don't want to be lectured about burden sharing while simultaneously being told that their deterrence depends on loyalty. What they want is a stable framework where their interests are respected, not some demand for loyalty. And these governments are not passive. They're active, strategic players with their own calculations, with their own vulnerabilities, and their own domestic political constraints. Most of them are already hedging between the United States and China, not because they don't care about great power balance, but they're simply not willing to sacrifice autonomy for someone else's preferred binary. So when American rhetoric gets too blunt, it doesn't pull them any closer. It pushes them exactly towards the kind of caution that Washington says it wants to avoid. But then there was the Taiwan question. Well, the absence of it. He didn't mention it, not once. But Taiwan is the single clearest test of credibility for the United States in Asia. It is where deterrence, where rhetoric, where hard strategic realities all collide. And like a chicken, Hegseth sidestepped it, even while broadly warning about Chinese dominance. That's very significant because if you want to project resolve, you must not avoid the issue that directly tests that resolve. So the speech ended up sounding like it was designed for rhetorical effect rather than a kind of strategic clarity. So if you strip that rhetoric away, what's left? Not much. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, they all have different priorities, but they all have one central concern. It's whether or not the United States will remain predictable enough, reliable enough to plan around. So You can have public demands for public spending on defense, but Trump wants more. He wants loyalty and this transactional form of diplomacy that takes way, way more than it gives. And once allies start wondering whether commitments are contingent on political moods, they will begin to hedge. And trust me, China will take advantage. So, what was missing in Singapore wasn't toughness. Well, Hegseth brought a lot of that. But what was missing was an answer to very, very, very tough questions. What does America want the region to look like in 5 years, 10 years' time? How does it plan to avoid turning burden sharing into a form of resentment? How does it plan to deter China while not making every single public statement sound like it's a warning shot? There was nothing in the speech about that. So the absence of this isn't trivial, and it's not nothing. Allies can work with a difficult partner, but it's very, very difficult to work with a very indecisive partner. And that's what America has become. And there's a real difference between strategic ambiguity, which can be useful, and ambiguity about America's overall direction, which just makes people wonder whether Washington knows what it's really trying to defend here. So, the damaging thing about Hegseth's speech is that it is kind of blurring the line between resolve and improvisation. And look, don't get me wrong, it sounded strong if you like that sort of thing. But strength is less persuasive when it isn't attached to a coherent foreign policy. And I wonder whether or not America has that kind of a thing. So Asia doesn't need to be convinced that China is a challenge. What it needs is a credible American response to the question of how deterrence will function when pressure rises. Pete Hegseth did not provide that. He just provided tuck-toff, a predictable burden sharing message, and a very, very, very confrontational message. That's not strategy. That's not policy. That's stupidity. And it's not just his tone. It's this broader American habit of treating Asia as a place where toughness can substitute for a strategy. It can't. Asia is too complex, too politically sensitive, and the governments are far too aware of the costs of great power rivalry to be moved by this macho talk. So Hegseth's shown very little sign of understanding any of this. So if the US wants a stable Asia, it's going to have to do better. It's going to have to treat allies with more respect and stop treating them as a free rider or pretending that every Chinese move is proof that being louder is better. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope this made sense, and I thank you for your support of this new podcast. Now, I want to make these videos short and sweet, and I know that many of you don't have a whole lot of time on your hands. So I hope this format works for you, and I hope you will continue to watch. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much.